Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Fuhrman and racing analyst Chris Wormy.
Welcome into the Stay Green podcast, the Bet the Board production, part of the Wondery Podcast Network. And oh, the fireworks we saw last week in Phoenix may not have been the best thing for your bankrolls. Hopefully you ended up on the right side of variance. I'm your host of the Stay Green podcast, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and racing analyst Chris Wormy. And Wormser, you can tell the people that the late caution, not once but twice, did not do well for us with the end result.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you that were live betting or that had listened to the pre-race poll that I was saying, I was looking to add Harvick live, and I know that you were able to get some of that, and so was I. And the other thing is, I was pulling for Harvick. Like that to me was really cool to see him out front in his final year. I know it's not his last race there, but just to see him win there and, lead a bunch of laps would have been really, really cool. But the caution came out. We were heavily invested on the 5 team, which obviously was good all day. And, late race caution, Harvick had said he always likes to be the aggressor if he can be. And I know that's why Childers put on 4 tires. But I knew that the minute anyone started taking 2, with Larson having that first pit stall, he saw that other drivers were taking 2. He was going to be able to call an audible and take 2. And he was able to do that, win the race off pit road, get out to that nice little comfortable lead, and then to have another caution quickly. And, kind of here we go. Not what we wanted to see, but good racing. The package was better, but it still wasn't, I guess it wasn't great.
Yeah, I mean, hey, for those folks that are new to the Stay Green podcast, by the way, stage 1, albeit extremely brief, much like we saw at Phoenix last weekend. We'll do a little race recap, bemoan our losses, talk a little bit of variance. Stage 2, we have an outstanding interview with one of the faces of NASCAR, Bob Pockrass, who was we're thankful enough, and he was gracious enough to give us some of his time earlier this week. And last but not least, a brief preview of what we should see this weekend in Atlanta, knowing it is a super speedway race. So going back to what you said kind of off the top about not just one caution, but the 2, if it's just one yellow flag, we're sitting pretty. Kyle Larson gets out to the lead, clean air, and it looked like he was pulling away from the 24. Alas, that wasn't the case. When you go about trying to ascertain if you've handicapped a race correctly or if there are things you would have done differently, I mean, you do this for a living. There's no better person to try and comment on this, but how do you go about grading the overall portfolio you put together when variance becomes the enemy like that?
It's actually, I hadn't really thought about kind of the race. I was there, so it's a different experience than when I'm sitting there at my desk looking at all the monitors that I have. There's not much that gets by me, but I was hosting people, and I hadn't thought much about the loss of Kyle Larson. So I'm not bummed about that. He was a good car. We had at a great price. We met 13 and 10. So it's not like we weren't wrong there. He was a great car. I also wasn't wrong about Harvick. And, the thing that kind of bothers me a little bit, what did we miss with Will Byron? And I think that's the one thing that bothers me a little bit. And he was so good, it wasn't like you could add him live until, later in the race when it looked like Larson or Harvick had the best chances to win. So I don't know. I have to go back and kind of.
Here's the thing, though. Here's kind of my take on it, and I know a lot of people will sound, "Oh, you guys are just bitter because you didn't have Byron." Look, I mean, we went through everything. We didn't elect to pre-week a guy like that. Thought he could be good. Never in our wildest dreams imagined he'd follow up with a race car as sporty as what we saw the week before from Las Vegas. But honestly, Worm, race morning at 8-1, I texted you and I said this may be a guy worth looking to try and bet against because I thought he was overvalued.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if that last green flag run stays green where Harvick ends up grabbing the checkered flag, I mean, Byron was dropping like a brick, but he was, and I will give credit, significantly better than I expected him to be in race day, and did have a car that was probably top 3 from start to finish.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he just got out to such a lead early on and just kind of, dominated stage 1, which seemed to go by in about 10 seconds with that 60 laps on the mile track. But, he had 47 fast laps. Larson had 54 fast laps, and Kevin Harvick had 49 fast laps. Kevin Harvick just came towards the end of the race, and man, he was pulling away, and I thought he was going to win the race. And, but these restarts, Harvick has never been the guy to go out and win a race on a restart. He's a guy that loves to lead a lot of laps and then kind of lose on a late race restart. So the other thing, too, you have to remember is these restarts are so line dependent, and the final restart with Larson, you had Reddick with 4 tires that was, outside of row 2, and you pushed Byron to victory. And then when Blaney decided to go 3 wide off of 2, Larson had no chance. He was barely able to hang on to a top 5. So at least we were able to cash that ticket. I do have to go back and, maybe reassess William Byron this year. Is we going to see him and Larson just be co-favorites the rest of the season? And we'll get into a little bit of the season stuff kind of maybe towards the end or right before the Atlanta preview here. But overall, a good weekend at Phoenix. But the racing still leaves a little bit to be desired here. I certainly don't like it to be the finale. It's just kind of not easy to pass. I wish it were better for that.
No, and it makes me wonder if NASCAR is going to look to try and change the the championship race away from Phoenix. There aren't any indications that will indeed unfold, but I'd love to see them go back to Homestead where you see comers and goers, you see multi-groove racing, you see the High Line come in. I mean, you and I joke all the time that they should run a lot more races at Darlington. We know that's not going to be the final race, given that it's received its prominent placement right back where it should be in the traditional Labor Day slot. So there are a lot of things to figure out. I think it's a step in the right direction with the lower downforce. And look, NASCAR isn't afraid to tinker with some of these short track packages, and maybe we'll see modifications going forward, or who knows, maybe we'll be blown away by the kind of racing that we can expect at Richmond when we go there in a few short weeks. But you mentioned the big picture, season-long stuff. We will get to that in stage 3, but we teased a major interview with Bob Pockrass. Again, extremely grateful that we were able to get some of his time. We know how busy he is, so without further ado, we'll bring in the NASCAR legend. If you're a fan of NASCAR, this man obviously needs no introduction. He's the number one source for all things across every series and a must-follow on social media for the latest and greatest updates. And Worm, you brought up the point when we were talking about the questions that we were going to ask Bob Pockrass before he came on. There are very few men or women in sport that you just use one name and everybody knows who they are. It's Madonna, it's Cher, it's Ronaldo, it's Messi, and it's Bob. Bob, welcome into the Stay Green podcast. Thrilled to have you on as this week's guest.
Man, that was an awesome introduction. I don't know how I'm going to back that up, but I'll do my best, Todd.
Well, it's funny that I feel like if you just say Bob and you're in the NASCAR world, people know who it's you. Like, oh yeah, I gotta, I don't know, I'll check with Bob. And like, that's my thought process on race day. It's like, I need to just get my information there. And there's one place you go, and that's Bob. And you don't need to say a last name. You just say, I'm going to go check out what Bob has to say.
Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate what you said. I'm sure there's some people who use it too and say, well, Bob said this, and maybe not so flattering tone, but I'm glad that this part is flattering.
So, Bob, we have plenty of ground we'll obviously try and cover on the show with you here. But the first question I have to ask you, is what everybody wants to know. If you weren't covering NASCAR, what would Bob Pockrass's dream job have been had you not gotten into motorsports 30 years ago?
That's a great question. I spent 12 years at the Daytona paper covering a lot of sports, and I think my favorite sports to cover were college sports because all the athletes think they're going to be pros, right? And so they kind of feel like they have the world at their fingertips. They're not necessarily as maybe guarded sometimes, especially if they're pretty confident in their abilities. Now, college programs have kind of stifled them probably a little bit more than when I covered them, but I always enjoyed their enthusiasm, and then plus, the the fact that most of them, or that many of them, are public institutions with public meetings and public records and things that you can look up, and the whole business of college sports is so fascinating. And so I mean, I guess some people might call it a cesspool, right? But it certainly is. It certainly doesn't. You don't have a shortage of topics, and especially now in the NIL days, and how that's going to progress, I think would be fascinating to write and report about.
It's definitely a different world. There's no doubt about it when you look at the world of amateur athletics versus everything that goes on in the professional ranks. And one of the other areas that we have to give you a ton of credit for is that you're great when it comes to fan engagement. So if you could kind of peel back the curtain a little bit for some of our loyal listeners in terms of the origin of the tweet up that I know you and Jeff Gluck have tried to make a fixture on the NASCAR calendar. And Chris and I were fortunate enough to attend one of those last year when we were live in the flesh in Richmond. And I was amazed with the amount of people that turned up on race day to watch you basically hold chapel on a Sunday afternoon and get up there to give the proper sermon before the drop of the green flag.
Well, Jeff and Gluck and I both worked for a magazine called NASCAR Scene back then. And in 2009, when Tour got started, and people started asking us, hey, can we say hello to you? And so Jeff actually was the first one who said, hey, I'm going to watch the Busch Series race from the grandstands. I'll be in this section. Come say hello. And it just kind of morphed into, okay, on race morning, 3-4 hours before the race, we say, hey, we're going to come to this spot and, come say hello if you want to say hello. And sometimes, they're other NASCAR personalities, either drivers or spotters or team executives who might come by to talk to the fans. And it just grew into this community of people who follow us on Twitter, who want to come say hello. And, I love social media in the sense that NASCAR is a very difficult sport to understand. And it's a way for us to be able to give information to fans. And so that's what journalist does. And so that's why I love it. And that's why I gravitate to it. And, I think it's just made for a great avenue for us to be able to deliver news and information. And, it certainly doesn't allow for a lot of depth, but it allows for a lot of basic information to be told. And, fans need to know what's going on, and they want to know about their favorite drivers, and they want to know who they should root for, or maybe why they should root for somebody, or why maybe they should root against somebody. And I think it just helps. Look, if fans spend a lot of they don't have a lot of free time or extra money, and if they're going to go to the effort to try to learn about their sport and potentially go to a race or spend their money on some merchandise, it's a great way to be able to help them make those decisions.
I mean, Chris, you had a good question that you asked me, and you should probably ask Bob. I mean, we know what his life is like during the season, 38 weeks. I mean, pretty much lives, breathes, sleeps, and eats all things NASCAR, but perfect form for you to ask him kind of what he does on his off days and, what Bob is like away from the track.
Well, I guess my question is just kind of your weekly schedule. I get that question often when I tell people that I bet on NASCAR for a living. They're like, wait, what does that even mean? What do you do? And I say, well, usually Mondays I tend to go back and rewatch the race. Tuesdays and then Monday nights I watch the like Atlanta. I will watch the previous race from last year, but probably both of them. And, I kind of have a progression in the week. A lot of media stuff is like Wednesday, creating content. Thursday is like my off day. And then depending on the weekend, you have practice and, then you have the Xfinity trucks and kind of the rest of the race weekend. So what does your week look like, with all this travel? And also, what does your week look like? And when was the last time you missed a race, a cup race?
I missed a race in August of 2021 for my niece's wedding. So, okay. So I missed Watkins Glen for
what was that like? What was that like? just because it's so, I imagine you're just still getting texted and tweeted at and. Oh,
and it was good that the wedding didn't really start till after the race was over. So maybe had my phone out streaming the race and watching it a little bit, but it's not, it's not the easiest. And yeah, you're still texting a little bit to help, help you. We still have a race day show on Sunday morning. So anything that you can help with that is appreciated by my folks. So I did spend a little time texting, but I did go to a lot of races in 2020. So I'm a little bit more used to that now than then. But, you asked about my normal week. It sounds a little bit like yours. On Mondays, I'm spending a lot of time watching the race from the night before, but then with my duties for Fox Sports, I'm watching also the races from that track the previous year. So it's funny, last year I didn't have to because NASCAR's new car, it didn't really mean a whole lot to watch all races. But this year, it's really important. We have a lot of meetings on Tuesdays, so I'm watching races from last year on Mondays, and then obviously doing some writing then as well. We come out with power rankings on Tuesdays. Tuesdays are spent with a lot of meetings and trying to plan for the upcoming week. Depending on if there could be penalties coming out, a lot of texts, a lot of, like last week, obviously a lot of follow up on Chase Elliott's injury, trying to get information. Wednesday's typically a writing day in research day and a lot of calls. Then Thursday's travel day, Friday, Saturday, Sunday at the track, and then back to Monday.
Talk about a rigorous schedule there. And Bob, don't let Chris fool you. He's lying if he said he went back and watched Atlanta last year. He wants nothing to do with anything akin to super speedway racing. And we'll get to Atlanta a little bit later before we let you go. But you did an outstanding interview earlier this week, a long sit down with Jenson Button. We've seen Kimi Räikkönen obviously make his NASCAR debut last year. I mean, is there ever a day where you see the sport gaining a bigger foothold on foreign shores, kind of outside North America? And we've seen what F1 has really done to try and grow all the ancillary activities where the racing on race day is secondary, because we know Max Verstappen has about a 97% chance to win every time he saddles up in the Red Bull car. But when you look at NASCAR versus F1, I mean, do you see similarities in terms of the business model? I mean, the on-track product's significantly better on NASCAR, but it oftentimes lacks some of that pageantry, some of that star power in a build-up to a race weekend.
Yeah, well, I see them as very different for a couple of reasons. First off, F1 has the manufacturer passion, right? They have, you're a fan of Ferrari, you're a fan of Renault, you're a fan of, soon Ford fans will be able to watch. And I'd be curious because, NASCAR 15 years ago, you go to Talladega and every car in the parking lot in the back windshield would have the stickers of cartoon characters urinating on a logo of either a Ford or a Chevy, right? You'd have those, but you no longer have that. In the U.S., you don't have as much passion for Ford and for Chevrolet, and F1 still is able to have that type of passion for their manufacturers. And then you add in their country passion, right? You have and NASCAR doesn't have that. NASCAR, it's not like you root for your hometown guy because he really never raced in your hometown a whole lot. And he probably was homeschooled, so he may not have had many classmates either. So I think NASCAR, to be able to build theirs, they have to do the one thing that F1 does well and make their race weekends events. They have to do things. They have to get their drivers more out there meeting fans. And they're a little bit in a different, people talk about Drive for Survive and that for NASCAR. But, I think NASCAR would like to push these drivers as more, that they're more like you. Well, I think Drive to Survive, is more lifestyles of the rich and famous, right?
That's a good point.
And I don't know that the NASCAR drivers necessarily fit that mold. So there's a lot of challenges for them. But when you talk about international, there are, I think NASCAR is still working on International Series. This next gen car that they introduced last year provides way more ability, not just for F1 drivers and IndyCar drivers to be able to come and race these cars because they're more like the sports cars they probably raced. But if NASCAR wanted to go to Europe and race, they could just ship all the parts. All the teams pretty much get all the same parts. They wouldn't have to even ship full built cars. They could just ship all the parts over to Europe somewhere and have each team organization send a handful of people for a few weeks and build a couple of cars if they wanted to.
Yeah, it is wild to hear you talk about some of the comparisons, how the NASCAR fan base is obviously different than F1. And Chris and I kind of joked about it when you see how excited NASCAR fans are to get North Wilkesboro back on the schedule for an all-star race. Meanwhile, F1 is traveling to Monaco, Shanghai, and some other spots. So it is clearly a diverse motorsport crowd that obviously gets involved. So we'll see if the crossover from some of those F1 legends, racing in the road courses, whether it's Jenson Button at COTA, whether it's Kimi Räikkönen when he was at Watkins Glen, can really create a little bit of synergy and some overlap. As we know, NASCAR, obviously, from a viewership standpoint, does considerably larger numbers, but you wouldn't know that the way that people talk about F1 and the way they're leading you to believe that somehow F1 races on a Sunday morning are doing something akin to what NFL games get on a Sunday afternoon. You mentioned fan engagement kind of at the top, and obviously we know that gambling is a hot button issue. Hell, that's the reason that NASCAR put funding behind our podcast last year to kind of get us off the ground. When you look at the teams and the league, I know you have relationships with everybody, to the fab shop workers, to the drivers, to the owners. Do we think gambling is going to be a successful vehicle for creating fan engagement in NASCAR? And if teams or drivers specifically realize some of the revenue generating potential as we look at a lot of the tracks that are adjacent to casinos, whether it's Kansas City, or Kansas, I should say, whether it's Dover, how do you feel the intersection of sport and gambling have come together with legalization over the last couple of years?
Yeah, look, at Vegas, there are at least a couple of cars with casinos on them, right? You saw a BetMGM car. You saw, obviously, a South Point car with the history of the Gaughan family in racing. I think you'll continue to see more of that. I think the big question, Todd, and I think maybe we've talked about this before, is NASCAR has the ability with all their data of like who has the fastest pit stop and who gets on and off pit road quicker. Theoretically, they should be able to monetize that data, right, through some sort of gambling by partnering with gambling entities, because you can't look on TV and time every pit stop, right? It's not like you can say, compared to like who throws the first interception of a football game, right? So they still haven't really been able to capitalize on that. But I think that potential is still there. And I think that's where they could really potentially, kind of separate themselves from many other sports.
Don't get Chris fired up over there, because when we talk about live betting for NASCAR, we've seen some of the limits that he does or does not have available when he picks apart some of the official NASCAR partners as far as a week in, week out basis. But I think you're exactly right. When you talk about the wealth of data that's out there, you look at some of the opportunities for fan engagement, and even if it's not necessarily real money wagering, when it comes to some of those secondary micro markets, I guess is the buzzword in our space, there are so many different ways to create free-to-play components where you can talk about a fastest lap and you can beta test a lot of the latency issues that are there or the information that you trust from an integrity standpoint. And Chris, I know you have some strong feelings on this. We talk all the time about, hey, look, if the markets are a little bit too advanced, all it's going to do is cater to the professional better. But curious to get your take on the ways that you think some of the data could be utilized and the way we could see operators really try and reinvent the wheel to create fan engagement throughout the course of stage one, stage two, and stage three.
Well, I think, Bob, do you remember RaceView?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love that. That was like the greatest you could experience the race in such a different way with RaceView. And I don't know why it went away. I don't know the whether there was politics or money behind it, but man, that was the best $120 I ever spent every year. And that had a lot of the information that you're talking about. I think just if you give just fans more information, whether they think it's important or not, I think just that ability to have it will always promote someone to try to find an edge, and maybe they enter a DFS lineup, like a daily fantasy, or whether they make a bet. I just really miss that. And I know that the teams still have that sort of information. And, is that something we could ever see something like that again?
I think so. I think they're working on some things. There's, who knows when the new TV deal comes into effect in 20 25, whether there could be more information and what's being provided to the broadcast partners in addition to what they can, stream online. So I would think that there is that potential there. I mean, obviously they want as much information as they can to be able to get out. And, I think they're going to be able to, again, I would say in the next couple of years, I would like to think there'll be an expansion of that.
Like even that fan view, I know that they went out of business, or the little things that you used to have at races, like that was awesome as well. And to see them go out of business kind of with COVID was a bummer. So I think that there's some opportunity. I think that, like you're saying, they need to ramp up. They need a little bit of time, because obviously the last couple of years with with COVID and then this new car, I think NASCAR's definitely had their hands full. So rolling out new stuff, I think it might take some time, but hopefully it'll be there.
Yeah. And then their other challenge obviously is at track, these tracks are only used really for big events once or twice a year. And so they don't have the Wi-Fi technology and the cell technology there at the racetracks. I think it's a challenge for them because, unlike a venue that might be used even 20 times a year, or, other stadiums and arenas used 80 to 100 times a year, to try to put in that infrastructure for 2 days is just, they just haven't been, I guess they've been investing in other things,
Sure. Yeah.
Other than that, they're trying, but it would take such a monumental investment at each place that they just haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, I guess that's a great point that you bring up, and something that, we all take for granted. I mean, I know, Chris, you go to a lot more races throughout the course of the year than I do and know some of the various setups. We obviously have talked about Wi-Fi connectivity and the challenges it can provide when you're cramming, 40,000 or more fans into a short track, let alone 100,000 plus at some of the bigger venues out there. So definitely things to think about, knowing that gambling isn't going away. And if there's any way to try and grow incremental eyeballs on the sport, whether it's turning NASCAR fans into casual bettors or turning some of the diehard bettors out there into NASCAR fans, which is kind of how I got brought into the sport, mainly learning at Chris's elbow. Bob, when we look at some of the drivers and we talk about, the passion for drivers and rooting for some of their favorite faces, we had an interesting incident unfold on Monday. Well, I guess I should go all the way back to Sunday, where what we thought could be a feud that might be over, passions reignited between Denny Hamlin, driver of the 11 car, and Ross Chastain, driver of the 1 car. Denny then comes out on actions detrimental on Monday and admits, hey, look, I realized I was out of contention. I was taking Ross down with me. NASCAR clearly didn't quite see that in the same light and go, we're going to sweep this under the rug. What's kind of your takeaway on these rivalries that are obviously great for sport, but when it comes to impacting the on-track product, NASCAR has a job to try and legislate things accordingly. But at the same time, do we give Denny credit for being open and honest instead of claiming, it just got loose? Or how do we go about rectifying these kind of situations that inevitably are going to happen as we see some of these drivers getting bigger and bigger platforms to talk about what's unfolding on track?
Well, the funny thing is that, we talk about data, and NASCAR and all the teams now get everybody's data. So they know his throttle data. They know his turning data. They know his brake data. So they can go back and look at that and pretty much know if something is intentional. But when somebody actually says it was intentional, much like William Byron did last year when he didn't mean to spin Denny Hamlin, but meant to hit him under caution, and he sent Denny spinning, it kind of forces – NASCAR probably feels like they're going to have to act because while they might like it in some ways, they know that if, Denny's wasn't in a very dangerous situation, didn't take out any other driver, but that is possible when these things happen. So you expect them to react to that, but you definitely like Denny being honest. And maybe it helps him in a situation where there is some question. And if he says, I didn't do it, maybe he gets, the benefit of the doubt since he was honest this time. I don't know. But I think NASCAR is kind of walks a tightrope here because you need those rivalries. In a lot of ways, I like to say that NASCAR is a competition that sometimes masquerades as a soap opera. because it's all about who hates who's going to get hired, who's going to get fired. I can't interview engines. I can't interview tires. I can't interview brakes. I can't interview suspension pieces. It's hard for me to explain why a car is faster than another car. But when how do you get enjoyment out of watching this? You get enjoyment because you know about the feuds. You know that this guy doesn't like this guy and is going to be really perturbed if that driver beats him. So you want those, you need those feuds to at least simmer so that there's some talking points. What you just can't have is for it to get out of control and then impact not just those two drivers, but other drivers as they compete for race wins.
Well, that goes for, last year, Bubba Wallace and Kyle Larson, and then ended up kind of taking out Chris Bell at Vegas last year. And I just think that, how much does kind of safety have to do with this? Because there was a drivers have at it a few years ago, or I don't know how many years ago, maybe 8 or so, but that was kind of like you handle it on the track, and all of a sudden we have some safety concerns. And I don't know that it's necessarily drivers have at it anymore. It's especially when Denny is a major spokesperson kind of for driver safety.
Yeah. And a guy who doesn't who wants to keep costs down for the teams, and he just wrecked a couple race cars, right? Yeah. But boys have at was more like, hey, if somebody bumps you to get by you, you shouldn't be afraid to bump them back to get by them. And and if you're battling for position and there's contact, NASCAR is going to feel probably okay about that. In the situation with Bubba Wallace last year, where he, just intentionally hooked Kyle Larson at a very high rate of speed. It was just so egregious from a safety standpoint that they're going to act. And, in fact, William Byron spinning a guy out under caution, he wasn't trying to gain a position. He was just trying to send a message. They're probably they look at that probably worse than just your typical, hey, I'm going to bump you out of the way for a spot. And if I've done that to you, then at some point you can do that to me.
Well, at least we know if we're ranking NASCAR rivalries now, 1A is still probably Denny and Ross Chastain, or maybe that feud has been put to bed, or it's Joey Logano against all of the 35 cars, knowing how the 22 has decided he wants to race people on the track and hasn't shied away from saying something to that effect when he gets the opportunity in the Fox booth. Denny said something interesting as well, Bob, not only about that situation with Ross Chastain, but talking about how far advanced Chevrolet is over the rest of the field. We have 4 races in the book already. Obviously, very different style tracks. Chevrolet has won all 4 of them, and we can say what we want about William Byron winning back-to-back races. It was either most likely going to be him or Kyle Larson off the restart. Kevin Harvick, though, had the best car before that late caution came out. When you look at the way that manufacturers have gone versus teams, 19 was the most wins for a race team back in 2019, I believe. It was JGR. Do we feel like we're at a point where HMS is that far ahead of the field? Are we overreacting a little bit, given what we've seen each of the last 2 weeks, where it's essentially been the 5 and 24 competing for that checkered flag?
I wouldn't consider it an overreaction. I mean, I think there's a feeling in the garage that Hendrick is, a tick above everybody else. And a lot of times that's all you need to be in order to be dominant right now. Obviously, NASCAR there have been a lot of changes to the cars over the last year. NASCAR tries to take the cars to the wind tunnel and tries to create and have everybody kind of in the same box or in the same window when it comes to numbers, when it comes to downforce and those kinds of things. But it does appear right now that Chevrolet has a little bit of an advantage. The hard part is, like, you look at Kyle Busch, so strong at Fontana in a Chevrolet, but the last 2 weeks they haven't been as strong. So is there something that Hendrick has found? Is it something that all the Chevrolets have? It may be a few more weeks before we totally find out, but I certainly feel like there's a sense that Chevrolet right now is a tick ahead. NASCAR probably take cars, I would say, sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks and go back and run them through the wind tunnel. And if there is a major difference, I would expect, another tweak I think that's typically the way
That's the
they
thing
roll.
with NASCAR. Like if one team starts to run away, it's always like, what can we tweak to make sure that this gets, a little bit more level. But I thought last year was great as a whole to see that many winners. But, you're still going to have the bigger teams be able to innovate and, kind of win on the margin. And, a half a tenth, a second a lap is, you win races with that advantage. So I'm kind of curious. We haven't, HMS is also kind of staring down a potential penalty. And at this point, we are recording on Tuesday afternoon, and we would expect, when do you expect to have some of the information for their louvers? That's what they're called?
Louvers.
Louvers.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I like to call them shutter looking things that direct air over the hood.
Perfect.
I think
Okay.
that's what they look like to me, and that's what they do. But yeah, I would think that we'll have them by, I said, we're taping this Tuesday night. I think we'll have them sometime Wednesday. I would think that there are going to be some penalties. And, I think all those drivers are going to win a race and make the playoffs. What could hurt them is whether NASCAR does issue any penalties that include playoff points, which they have done in the past. And then drivers at the end of the regular season get additional playoff points. So all these playoff points help to advance in the playoffs. If they don't finish as high in the regular season because they've been docked points, it could impact them there. So, but look, they took these pieces on Friday at Phoenix, and Hendrick went out and won the pole.
Yeah,
and they led 250 or 60 something laps at Phoenix. So who knows if they really made that big of a difference, but we do expect to see Hendrick get penalized.
Yeah, I guess with one last question I have with Hendrick, I don't know how close you are with some of these drivers. Have you talked to Chase Elliott at all? Is that something you do? Like you're able to send a text or?
I haven't talked to Chase. Talked to some people around him. They seem to be feel like his recovery is progressing well. But a broken leg, you don't really know until you're able to put weight on it, right? And it's only been, it hasn't even been 2 weeks, so they just don't know yet whether. They say his recovery will take approximately 6 weeks, and that'll be the big thing once he hits that point where he's allowed to put weight on it, how he feels.
It does create such an interesting dynamic. Obviously, everyone that's a race fan wants to see Chase back behind the wheel of the 9 car. You are always curious how some guys will do when they assume that responsibility. And Josh Berry didn't disappoint with his performance on Sunday at Phoenix. But when we're talking about Chase Elliott, Worm is getting a lot better at this co-hosting thing, Bob. It provides the perfect segue to what would normally be Chase Elliott's home race this weekend in Atlanta. And given the level of unpredictability, it's not a race that we do a ton with from a betting perspective. Do teams know going into this race or after practice, honestly, if they have a realistic shot? And then when you talk about some of the smaller teams, how much more emphasis do some of the drivers, whether it's a Ricky Stenhouse who won at Daytona, or maybe Corey LaJoie this week, Noah Gragson, who looks like he's a little bit off the pace for Legacy Motorsports, put into their super speedway packages, knowing that this gives them the best opportunity to punch a ticket directly to the postseason?
Well, I think there's a reason why you don't pay as much attention from betting wise. They don't even have practice this week because teams barely would ever go practice on these types of tracks because they're worried about wrecking their cars. It does, for the smaller teams, a team like Corey LaJoie, Spire Motorsports, their engine lease program might have certain races where they get like what they would call like the A package from the engine builder. And then they may have other races where it might be what we call the B package. For these races, they're going to get the A package because they know they have a better chance of running up front. Yeah. So they will, they look at things, and they will spend more time probably on this car than they would potentially other cars, just making sure that it's exactly the way they want. And I assume most of these teams, except for Ricky, whose Daytona 500 car has to stay in Daytona as part of a track tours. That's what happens when you win the Daytona 500. But I imagine like Corey LaJoie and Noah Gragson, the cars that they took to Daytona, if they survive Daytona, they're probably been massaged on as much as possible to be fully ready for this weekend.
This is where, Bob, Chris and I normally put on our tinfoil hats back in the day when it always happened that when you go to Daytona, the biggest NASCAR storyline just happened to have a little faster car outside the draft to be sitting on the pole leading into the Super Bowl of the sport. But that's very interesting when you talk about the A and B packages, something I definitely didn't know when it came to handicapping. And I guess the last thing that I have for you, we lost a high tire wear track again this year in Fontana. We're not sure exactly what the future of that racetrack will be in Southern California. We had the repave in Atlanta, and it took away a lot of that high tire wear that NASCAR diehards, or maybe bettors more than anybody else, really like. Do we feel this is a trend that's going to continue? Does NASCAR want to continue pushing for more super speedway style racing, or is it all about trying to create that balancing act, basically being able to create a more competitive version of what we've seen at Vegas and Kansas, or erring on the side of Texas, where we've had absolutely no fall off? And we'll leave the tire issues completely out of this dialogue, given what transpired last year during the postseason.
Yeah. Look, they want to change Fontana to a short track because they feel like fans were asking for more short tracks. I think this is still kind of be determined, Todd, because, a lot of these tracks that have been repaved in the last 5-10 years have been repaved with a mix that's designed to wear a little bit more, are designed to not be as smooth after 5 years or 6 years or 7 years. So hopefully those will then start creating more tire wear. The challenge is that, NASCAR introduces a new car last year and the tire manufacturer is going to be conservative, right? Because
Sure.
they don't know yet exactly what these teams are going to do to the car. The teams obviously Atlanta last year, you had a lot of tire issues. And so Goodyear changed the construction of the tire starting in late July. And so will be the first time at Atlanta with this type of tire construction, which, it seemed to improve the durability of the tires over the last half of last year. And now we'll get to see whether the same is true for Atlanta.
All right. So the moral of this story then, and I'm paraphrasing Bob, Chris, is that we're going to go to Darlington. We're going to race there 30 times. So we have exactly the kind of tire where we want an ability to profit off comers and goers throughout the field. And I lied, Bob. I have one final question for you, and you can be honest with us. This is a safe space around here. When you make your picks every Saturday or Sunday morning, do you ever look at the betting odds before you try and stack up your top 4, your top 5, and offer up your long shot? Or are you going purely off the information that you've seen with your own eyes and the folks that you've talked to around the garage?
Yeah, I pretty much go with what I see with my own eyes. We get obviously being in TV, I get a lot of stats from people. So I pull up the sheet that has everybody's last 10 races at that track and take a look at it. I take a look at practice, especially like 10-lap practice speeds and 15-lap practice speeds. And I make a decision. I don't usually look at, I may see the odds because we tend to put them up, during a show. So, but beyond that, I don't really, I don't use those when I consider it. But I do try to, just for all the gamblers and fantasy players, I try to post my picks at 8 a.m. Eastern on race morning, because that's the way that way I get too many questions. Love for social media 20 minutes ago, but the questions from people trying to do picks can get a little overwhelming. So that's, if anybody wants to look at my picks, that's when they come out, 8 a.m. on race day.
Yeah, we love the content.
That's hard when Phoenix changes their clocks, and I'm not sure when I set the tweet up the night before whether I'm going to get it right.
Well, you know what, Bob? Funny story about that, and I'll embarrass Chris right now because, like I said, it's a safe space. So I shot him a text a few minutes before we were set to get going. Thankfully, he was home because he didn't realize, being a Phoenix resident, that 6:30 Eastern meant 3:30 in his time zone and not 4:30. So I'm glad he could go scrambling back to his seat to contribute to this interview. Otherwise, it would have just been a one-on-one between me and you, which, you know what? A lot of our Stay Green listeners might have preferred in the grand scheme of things, but we allowed Chris to hang out and be an innocent passerby in this particular instance.
Gee, thanks. Yeah, I just was thinking to myself, I have to talk with Bob at 4:30 today. That's what I was like telling my wife. I'm like, I got a phone call at 4:30. But fortunately, I was right at my desk when he called. So, yep. Bob, I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to chat with us. This is, in our gambling community is kind of a tight group, and we rely on you often for just the facts of the race. I mean, it's just really important. So we really appreciate all the hard work you put in.
Well, and gambling, helps me too, because it keeps people interested. And it was once, a lot of people ask me, when is the competition caution going to be during a race? And I once asked people, I said, why do you need to know 4 hours before a race when the competition caution is? Are you going to text Chad Knaus with a little bit of advice on what to do? And they told me, they said, no, we actually, if you're doing stages or whatever for either gambling or fantasy purposes, it's good to know because it can help you with your predictions. So, I sometimes there's a method behind, there's always a reason that maybe you don't know about.
Well, especially if you look at like Daniel Suarez, I think in the second Darlington race last year, he had the pass-through penalty because he failed inspection 3 times. And my thing was, it rained. And so they had the competition caution, which then he was going to obviously be the lucky dog because it was like 20 laps. So I do understand why it is important to understand when that competition caution might be thrown. And then he, got lucky with it raining anyway. So, yep, I lost a few bets because I bet against Suarez thinking he'd get pinned a lap down, and then he didn't. So
yeah, the bigger thing we need to prevent against in this business, Bob, is that late caution with like 6 to go. And when Larry Mack comes on and talks about his race trends and the potential for overtime, we had a feeling that wasn't going to work out in our favor, being heavily exposed to the 4 and Kevin Harvick with some live bets and Kyle Larson going into it. So going through that race without a piece of the 24 did not bode well for the overall welfare of our financial portfolio. But that's the nice part about the NASCAR season. 1 race down, plenty to go. Can't thank you enough for all your time. We know you are a busy man and encourage all of our loyal Stay Green listeners, who I'm sure already do, but to follow Bob on Twitter at Bob Pockrass. Bob, best of luck the rest of the season. And you know what? We may have to beg, borrow, and steal some of your time to get you on right before the postseason to kind of reset the playoff picture with about 10 races to go.
I'd love to be on again. Thank you, guys.
Wormser, if I set odds on what kind of job you thought Bob would be doing if he hadn't gotten into NASCAR, did you in your wildest dreams believe he would say covering collegiate athletics in one capacity or another?
Yeah, I had no idea what to expect when you asked that question, because he just kind of cements himself as like just Bob Pockrass for NASCAR. It's hard to imagine him doing anything else, but he definitely, the NIL stuff, when he brought that up, I thought that was kind of interesting, because I thought he would be more of kind of the romantic college athletes play for the love of the sport, but he was definitely brought that up.
Hold on a second. The bottom line is this. I don't care what kind of gaudy numbers you put on paper. You were not getting an NIL package as a Division III defensive back in under any capacity. Maybe there was a Whataburger in Michigan or a local creamery that might have given you free custard after wins, but that might have been about the extent of what you were taking home.
I wasn't going to get any of that. No, I was paying at a small private school to play football. So that's about how good I was. But Bob's awesome. And hey, I don't know if maybe you know the answer to this. Do they have our writers and journalists in the NASCAR Hall of Fame?
Yeah, there are a couple out there, and there's no doubt. I mean, when you're talking about a first ballot guy, given Bob's commitment to the sport and what he means for sharing information, the relationships he's built, he will be a guy that gets enshrined in Charlotte when his time comes. But, judging from the energy we see on social media, the tweet ups, and just our brief interview with him, I mean, this guy has a lot of runway left to go when it comes to covering the sport. He's made NASCAR his life, and we're all better as fans and bettors to have a guy like that to be our eyes and ears trackside when we can't be down there. The one thing I do feel remiss, I didn't ask him when he professed his love for college sports. I should have asked him if he'd filled out an NCAA tournament bracket, but didn't want to put him on the spot. But again, a special thanks to Bob Pockrass. Outstanding visit with him, and it's followed up a couple of great guests we've had this season. Danielle Trotta to kick things off, Brian Murphy last week, and hopefully another great guest on deck as we look to preview COTA next weekend. But on to stage 3, and normally this is an in-depth breakdown of where the NASCAR Cup Series is headed added next. But at Atlanta Motor Speedway, we don't have that multi-groove racing. We don't have that tire wear that we've grown accustomed to in the past since we got the repave last year. And when you're looking for track details, again, repave back in 2021, as soon as they finished the July race there, from one of the best tracks with the highest tire wear to its current form where, hey, look, it's a decent racing product. It's just not very bettable. 28-degree banking, a narrower racing surface. With the additional 4 degrees of banking they added, Atlanta now has the steepest banking of any intermediate track on the NASCAR circuit. And I ask you this just because it's an exercise that we always do. As far as track comps are concerned, super speedways all the same, or do you see similarities or differences when we look at Atlanta compared to Daytona and Talladega, given the fact that it's only a mile and a half?
Well, I think the biggest difference is going to be just the width of the track. I mean, Talladega is so wide that you have just more options towards the end. You can get 4 wide kind of coming to the line there, where I think Atlanta and Daytona are obviously a little bit more narrow. The crazy thing is Bob kind of threw a curveball at us when he said that they didn't have practice this week. I mean, I did not see that coming. Hold
on. Full disclosure on that. You and I didn't see it coming last week when we're watching practice. I'm texting you going, wait a second. We got an A and B group for practice on Saturday. I don't see this anywhere on the schedule. And thankfully, they clarified that was just an error in some of the programming, that there was not going to be a secondary practice session.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch the practice on Friday at Phoenix, Mike Joy made it sound like that they were going to have 40 minutes of practice where 20 minutes A and B. And I remember he texted me and I'm like, man, am I that out to lunch that I didn't know that they were going to be practicing again? So it was when Bob had brought up the point, I thought he was joking. I actually had to check after the interview, like, oh man, wait, they aren't practicing this week. So I was hoping that, after watching practice, that maybe it wouldn't be this pack racing, because it's not like they have restrictor plates. It's just this, lower downforce, higher downforce, lower horsepower, and so they just kind of all run around the same. However, Bob came in with a few nuggets on some of these smaller teams, or like us less funded teams, that they get these A engines for races like this because they can compete. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this week. I was hoping, I'll probably still watch the Xfinity and the Cup race and maybe see if there's something to pick off live, just in case it does get a little strung out. I don't think that that's going to happen with just 1 year of track wear. But, on the outside chance that there is, I don't want to miss an opportunity to make some money if there's some live bets out there.
Yeah, we can only hope that that's the case, knowing that we're going to come back to Atlanta a little bit later in the year. And obviously, when you look at the odds, that's kind of how odds makers have priced this field. You see an absolute logjam of all the biggest names in the sport. Some books as low as 9-1 on the favorite. I've seen consensus around 12, and a basically hodgepodge of the who's who up in that 20-1 range. You do have the opportunity to maybe isolate a long shot or two if you look to go further down the board. But to your point, we know the emphasis that some of these smaller teams place on these type of races. We saw Ricky Stenhouse in the 47 win the Daytona 500. Bob obviously brought up the fact that he can't use that same car because it is on full display at the NASCAR Museum down there. But when you're looking at all of these different variables, you have guys that know there's 6 to 8 races a year that they have a legitimate shot to try and win, and they can then ultimately make sure they finish in the top 30 and have a chance to go to the NASCAR postseason. When you look at the way things unfolded last year, though, Trackhouse seemed to have it figured out, specifically at Atlanta, and I know I'm selling Ross Chastain a bit short because he was as good at Talladega, but I mean, Chastain, a pair of second-place finishes at Atlanta, also raced well at Dega. Daniel Suarez, 4th and 6th place at Atlanta. So that may be a team not exactly priced like long shots, but still not mentioned in the same breath as the favorite when you look at some of those guys. Suarez as low as 25-1, Chastain a little bit shorter in that 12-1 range. That kind of caught my eye, but again, full disclosure, haven't run to bet either of those drivers yet as we sit here in the middle of the week.
In Chevys, and by the way, if you don't have that Chevy engine, it doesn't seem like you have the same competitive advantage as obviously the Chevys. So, I think that Ross, obviously he likes to mix it up. This is where you have to be really aggressive. And same with Suarez. He'll be aggressive too. Like I said, it's just not a great, especially at this point in the week, I'm not super excited to go bet anything. Like I said, I'll tune in to the to the Xfinity race and see what happens there. The trucks, I know, the trucks even racing this weekend. That's how out to lunch I am on.
No, I feel like the trucks race once and they give them like another 6 weeks off
before
they bring them back. I mean, I'm not even sure the official truck schedule, but I know they definitely don't ship them out west until much later in the year. I mean, they get Vegas twice, but they do get some time off. And you know what? This makes for great podcasting right now as I look to pull up the schedule and try and filibuster here.
Well, I want to do like a little recap of the...
I do. There is the trucks. Hold on. The trucks do race on Saturday.
Yeah.
You got a little double dip, 2:05 Eastern and 5:05 for the trucks in Xfinity. So I'm sorry that I took shots at the truck series since they will be back on track.
Yeah, those things are so aero dependent. I mean, it's going to be, it's going to race like pack racing, and that's just really hard to predict. But I just kind of want to go back and try to take some information that we got from Fontana, Vegas, and Phoenix, and what does that look like for the rest of the year? Because, if you listen to like Door Bumper Clear, you listen to Denny's podcast, it's like they're like saying that like Hendrick could win more than 19 races in a year, and without Chase Elliott, and that's just, I don't know that I see that quite yet. I mean, Kevin Harvick was pretty good at Phoenix, and that might be a little bit of an outlier, but I just kind of want to set the stage here for the next couple races based on what we've seen. So you had a Chevy and Kyle Busch win at Fontana, but that's a complete outlier type track. That is even different than, you almost don't even have a track comp. I mean, yes, you have the fall off at other tracks like Darlington and Homestead, but they just race completely differently. Then you go out to kind of a smoother cookie cutter type Vegas, and you have Byron and Larson just kind of dominate. And then you do the same thing at a short track with a new package in Phoenix. And it's like, whoa, are we onto something here with this 24 and this 5? I think Atlanta, if we just look at the next 5 races, Atlanta, I don't know that you can take a lot of information from this and apply it to other tracks. I just don't think that's just not something you can do. Even if it's, even if you get Stenhouse to win there, I don't think you make Stenhouse like the heavy favorite at Talladega, because it's just, you have to be a good, aero racer, but you still need to get lucky. You still need cautions to kind of fall. I mean, Kyle Busch wins the Daytona 500, in other circumstances. So, but if you go to Austin, I think is a big race in 2 weeks. This is going to kind of unveil like, hey, how are these cars going to unload at road courses? I mean, it seems to be a foregone conclusion that Hendrick is just going to be fast there too, but I don't know. I would like to see what some of these other teams have, especially Kyle Busch in the 8, to see if he unloads like Reddick did last year, and because that'll set the stage for the 6 road courses that we have this year. Then we're going to go back to a place like Richmond. I just don't see William Byron and Kyle Larson dominating at Richmond. I just don't see that. I think that there could be some other guys in there, like a Harvick or maybe a Logano, or even a Chris Bell. Those guys that are really, really good at kind of conserving tires and getting better throughout the race. And then you go to Bristol Dirt. I don't think that the Chevys have necessarily an advantage there. And then off to Martinsville, I think that's where you might see the Hendrick cars, kind of step it out a little bit. And then you're back to Talladega. So that's kind of the next 5 races. And I just think it's important. Let's not crown Hendrick Motorsports yet. We talked with Bob a little bit, and NASCAR likes to make their changes, and those changes like to level the playing field. So wherever the Chevys have their advantage, I think that some of these teams will find it. And I don't think we'll see Hendrick win 19 races or 20 races to break JGR's record. So I just kind of wanted to...
No, and I was going to say, I'm glad you did, because the other thing about it, too, NASCAR doesn't always inform the general public when they're making changes. You may watch a race and suddenly the Chevys, for whatever reason, aren't as competitive as what they were early in the year. So I think, as we talk about all the time, betting markets are dynamic. They're fluid. Odds makers know that William Byron and Kyle Larson have been the best 2 cars consistently week in, week out, but we shouldn't be discounting a guy that you mentioned in Christopher Bell, who quietly, when you look at Bell's results, has 3 finishes inside the top 6 this year. The only race he didn't finish inside the top 6 was Fontana. Don't look now, but the Fords made serious gains last week, and it wasn't just Kevin Harvick, who was an improperly timed caution away from winning that race, but he now has 3 top 10 finishes on the year. Chase Briscoe came to life last week with a 7th place finish. So let's see what the dynamic and how things shape up in the pecking order when we get to Richmond, because who knows, we could have a role reversal and maybe it's the Fords that are right there in the thick of things. But I guess that provides a logical question for what I want to ask you. When you look at the tracks and how they lay out, does it change how you're approaching odds to win the championship? I know you're not running to bet William Byron, because at 8-1 it makes absolutely no sense. It's not as though we're going to get to the postseason with 10 races to go in the year and Byron is going to go off as a 3-1 favorite atop the field. If Byron Byron is good, Larson will be good, and it shouldn't mean we ignore some of the other big names in the sport.
Well, especially Chase Elliott too. I mean, if the 24 and the 5 are going to be clicking off all these wins, you have to imagine that if Chase Elliott was in the 9, nothing against Josh Berry, but he's not Chase Elliott in a cup car yet. And, that he's going to come back. He's going to win one race. He's going to get in the top 16. And, if they haven't granted him, I mean, I imagine he's going to be able to race in the playoffs. So, that could really mix things up too. You're going to have to win races, whether you late in the season. You just kind of have to. You're not going to just be able to point your way through. So Chase is going to have to win, whether he was, racing all season or he was just kind of going in there for the playoffs. But man, I'll tell you what, the one guy I would say, if you're looking to fire would be that Larson. I don't know that he's going to do this. I don't know how good he's going to be this week in Atlanta. It's kind of a crapshoot. So, I haven't invested anything on Larson to win the championship. But when it comes to handicapping, there's like a very clear haves and have-nots. And right now, when I say the haves, I'm just saying the 5 and the 24. I'll just leave it at that. Yeah. Those are the guys you have to kind of predict where the market's going to go. When we jumped on Larson at 13-1 last week, when they opened, that's because we just knew where the market was going to go. And you just have to understand that if with William Byron, 2 wins under his belt, that let's just say he opens 12-1 somewhere or 13-1, you have to know that if he unloads well or qualifies well, his odds are going to be 6 or 7-1. So I think it's just important to understand where the market's going to go with those 2 drivers. And also when you're betting live, if Byron gets to the lead, he's going to get priced more like Larson does when he gets to the lead when you're talking about live betting. So just keep that in mind, that you now have the 24 in the same company as the 5 when it comes to pricing. And this week he's the favorite, and he should be. He's the only guy, just right around 10-1 or 9-1 here that I'm looking at Canby site. So, but it's just, you have to understand where the market's going to go. That's really, really important. And right now, the 24 and the 5 are going to have massive adjustments if they look really, really good.
No, and I think that's important when you're looking at week odds and trying to figure out how you're going to build your portfolio, because Larson did go off as in the prohibitive favorite category right around 3.5-1 depending on the book. And even Kyle Busch, who was 10-1 or 12-1 all week, unloaded poorly, practiced like he was in a jalopy, still obviously finishes inside the top 10 by hook or by crook. His odds don't ever really drift out. So there's a lot of guys that you pay attention to that books go, we don't care how bad they look in practice, we're not going to give you a better price. But there are guys that they'll be much more aggressive when it comes to shortening. And this is the portion of the program, though, where I put on my F1 hat and say, for all the talk at the top of the field, I'm fascinated by what's unfolding at the back, because right now the Rookie of the Year race between the 2 guys that we thought were front runners, it's all about who the toughest Smurf may be between Ty Gibbs and, of course, Noah Gragson, who are really struggling to get finishes. Yeah,
that Gregson's just kind of having one of those years where it's like, okay, we're struggling with speed and handling, and then, I can't get anything right on pit road either. So I think that's those mistakes are really compounding. I would like to see Gragson, find some speed in the race car, because I just think I'd love to see him mix it up at the front of the field a couple times this year. Ty Gibbs, I think he's kind of impatient, like almost like a Kyle Busch-esque, just thinks that he should be running way, way better. And, to hear Denny talk about like how fast that the Chevys are pulling away, like, maybe cool your jets a little bit. You have to learn, and those guys will. But yeah, at this point, I think both of those guys I think that they would be disappointed at the start of their season.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt, hey, it's a steep learning curve. Sometimes it can take a lot of these drivers 25, 50, 100 races before that light clicks on. So it'll be interesting to watch how these guys go about the maturity process and how they handle some of the potential struggles, knowing it's not like you go grab your full-time ride in a cup car and suddenly you're out there running top 5 week in, week out. Yeah. Should have done this earlier in the program. Was remiss in not doing so. You, of course, can follow Chris on Twitter. That's at ChrisWormy15. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod for all things Bet the Board, including our NCAA tournament coverage, cardboard chat, and a variety of other things that we have on the docket going forward. And Worm, this is normally the portion of the show where we try and find the most actionable element. We've had pretty good luck in terms of our pre-week positioning. Kyle Larson, top 5. A lot of closing line value there, and you needed all of those 5 finishing positions when Larson got shuffled back, finishing 4th. So thoughts and prayers to those folks who got a little greedy like we did, trying to bet the outright or even a top 3 price. Thankfully, if you bet it earlier in the week, top 5 gets you home safely. But as far as Atlanta, and this, of course, comes with the knowledge that it is going to be a tiny position, if at all, is there anything you think is worth it from a value perspective or a little bit of rooting interest this weekend, not knowing if we're going to see pack racing like we saw last season?
Well, I'm going to jump on the Corey LaJoie train. I think that car has performed better or outperformed expectations so far this season. And this is a place where he's been competitive. And, he had a chance to win this race last year. And, if if it wasn't Chase Elliott that wrecked him, I think that there would have been a lot of people pissed off at that scenario, but Chase gets away with it. But I'm going to stick with Corey LaJoie. Man, I don't know that I can quite get on board for the win, but I definitely think that top 5 price, he's anywhere from, I think, 7 to 1 to 7.5 to 1, the top 5. I do think he will be there. There will be a point in the race when it's like, wow, Corey LaJoie has a chance at winning this thing. And my only hesitation is if he gets up there, he's going to do something desperate just to win versus just kind of get a good finish, or at least that's what he did last year. So I'm hoping this year he realizes, hey, you know what? It's okay to get a top 5. It's really, really good for our program to run the top 3 or top 5. So that's the price I like. I like that Corey LaJoie, top 5, 7.5 to 1 in that range. And if you want to, maybe sprinkle, break it into like maybe a win, top 5 and top 10, and just hope he runs well. That would be the only thing that I see at this point in the week. And I'm kind of pulling for Corey LaJoie as well. I'd like to see him. I'd love to see him get a win. It'd be great for the sport.
Hey, that's every now and again you try and do a little bit of value prospecting. Every race doesn't offer the same opportunities, and we know the trips to Daytona that we make twice a year, Talladega twice, and now Atlanta twice, significantly more challenging to get heavily invested there. So a little bit of Corey LaJoie to wet the whistle and keep people in action this week as we look to build on last week's Kyle Larson top 5. Unfortunately, our race day head-to-head matchup last week at Phoenix, a busted wheel from Eric Almirola. But candidly speaking, Ryan Preece ran a hell of a lot better than we thought he would, and I'm not sure even if Almirola stays out there for a full 312 laps that Almirola ends up right where he needs to be with a chance to win that match.
Yeah, you know what? I actually want to talk about this a little bit. There's something going on in, the expectation of the car in practice and the way that they run a race. And what I mean is Ryan Preece was pretty terrible in practice and qualifying. So it's almost like their expectations were so low. It's like, hey, a top 15 would be a great run. And all they did was minimize mistakes and then just stay on the lead lap. And I'll tell you what, if I am betting against anyone, I'm going to feel sorry for myself. If I'm ever fading anyone, they are guaranteed the lucky dog at least once in a race. Now, this time, Ryan Preece was the last car on the lead lap after stage 1. And it's always so important if you're fading someone, to get them pinned a lap down is huge. But they were able to stay on the lead lap. They executed at a really, really high level. They didn't make any mistakes, and they ended up getting a great finish. I'm proud of that 41 team for kind of sticking it out. If you compare that with other guys that, like an Almirola, who he qualified poorly but had this major expectation because he was really good in practice and didn't qualify well, but good in practice, they're trying to go out there and get a top 5, and it's almost like they're stretching. They're like, hey, we should be out here running in 8th place, and we're running 15th. So that expectation of some of these guys that we tend to fade because they look poor in practice, the expectation's so low that they're just willing to, like, hey, if we can pick up 2 spots here, 3 spots here, and finish 15th to 12th, that's actually a really good finish. And that's what happened. And I'm happy for that 41 team. I think that the 14 team did that as well with Chase Briscoe, getting him a decent finish, because he did not have the same vehicle or the same type of car that he had last year. So that's kind of my thoughts on and I don't know, that's just me kind of talking out loud. I'm curious what other people think about that. That's something we probably should have asked Brian Murphy. So maybe I'll send him a tweet and ask him if that's something where, hey, if we can get a top 15 out of this car, should we take it, or are we going to get overly aggressive and maybe make a mistake trying to get a position that maybe they didn't quite deserve? Does that make sense?
No, it makes a ton of sense. And it's a lot of the advanced underlying metrics that used to be out there about cars that were in equal performing equipment that were able to grab a couple of spots here or there. And you mentioned something that stuck with me, talking about how you're reluctant to fade good drivers. And that's what good drivers do. Look, if I put any of the guys that are in the Cup Series in an absolute rocket, 34 of them could go out there and win a race, especially if they're in clean air. But what do the Kyle Bushes, the Kyle Larsons, and the Kevin Harvicks do? If I give them a 15th place car and they're able to get me a top 10 finish, that's absolutely massive, especially in this day and age where NASCAR is all about parity. You look at the qualifying and practice times, guys are separated by a tenth of a second. So it's figuring out where you can find that line, where you can potentially pick up a spot or two on pit road. The little things that you can do to move yourself from a fringe top 10 performance getting inside the top 5, and all things that have to factor in to the calculus when you're trying to identify an edge in a matchup and going, you know what? I can understand why the money is coming in on driver A over driver B based on what we saw in practice, but at some point there has to be a little bit of buyback, and I'm honestly gradually starting to change my thought process as well, because historically in NASCAR, you don't want to fade matchup steam because it's basically you beat the market by 60, 70 cents, you kick your feet up and you know you're going to have a winner. It's not that way right now in the Cup with such slim margins between. One thing I will say though, the one driver that disappointed me more than anybody else, as I circle all the way back, Martin Truex never had a car that even sniffed the top 15. I'm very interested to see what the 19 can do going forward, because he's been a little bit of a disappointment so far, other than where he finished with the 7th place spot at Vegas, and of course obviously winning the Clash. Hasn't looked like he's got a race-winning car or a hot rod that's gaining anything close to what we've seen from some of his JGR
Yeah, that's
teammates.
a great point about Truex. I just, coming out of the Clash, I was like, oh man, I didn't picture him winning the Clash for one, and then to actually have like that dominant of a car and go out there and do it. I'm like, man, maybe, and he was so fast last year on these 1.5 mile tracks. I mean, there was a point in every 1.5 mile race where Truex was the fastest, and he's been nothing. We haven't talked about him getting competitive or being fast. I mean, he was fast in Fontana, I guess you could say, early on, and then he had some issues, but other than that, I kind of agree. It'll be interesting to see. Like I said, Atlanta, we're more of a sideline race for us, but Austin and Richmond, then Bristol, Dirt, and Martinsville, those next 4 weeks are gonna they're gonna be great. I'm really looking forward to the next 5-6 races.
I know pre-week when it comes to Coda, you're jumping on Jensen Button at 25-1.
Gosh,
you're going to take the F1 champion, racing a stock car for the first time. Thrilled that he's getting 20 minutes of practice. But again, credit to NASCAR, getting some big names involved and trying to create a little bit more global intrigue when it comes to these road courses and the level of familiarity from former Grand Prix champions. All right, my friend, I think we've done enough damage. Again, a special thanks to Bob Pockrass. If you don't already follow him on Twitter and you consider yourself a NASCAR bettor fan, I'm not sure what the hell you're doing. You can follow Chris on Twitter at ChrisWormy15. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me there. Most importantly, again, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod, and come Sunday afternoon from Atlanta Motor Speedway with the Corey LaJoie Top 5 ticket in hand. Hopefully we'll see you at the window.